archival pictures, which was then creating a record. I think the last maps that were drawn of Ranvar were done in the British time. And post that, the public domain maps were actually created by the studio, and we try to, have them in an openly downloadable resource, stuff like that. Obviously, Bandra is a land of amazing built beauty. Like, so there's that Priscilla Villa in the middle, which is inhabited by this lovely lady who's the principal of St. Joseph's School, and she has, amazingly, doggedly, stubbornly managed to maintain it, make sure it's not taken over by the builder lobbies, stuff like that. So there are these lovely pockets of resistance that are visible in Bandra, and it's something to be celebrated daily. For us, this obviously set us on a very interesting, multi-headed kind of a path. We had a lot of pedestrian maps created. We had, in fact, Rabbi Shergill write a poem for one of the Celebrate Bandras called Tu Aavi Bandra. We kind of, had a lot of editorial kind of contribution to the Celebrate Bandra souvenir, which was trying to get, obviously trying to, in a very novice way, do what Vivek is doing amazingly well with festivals like this, to get multiple voices to talk about their own connection with Bandra. And also small public exhibitions, interaction with residents, trying to document lived knowledge, lived heritage, stuff like that. So it was a sort of a fairly multi-headed project. And at the end of these kind of more effervescent experiments, I think what kind of started emerging was a few areas of resonance, right? So these are, and again, being in a commercial studio, these are areas that we really look for and really kind of adopt. One amazing thing that came out of this was something called the Bandra Collective, which is we realized that there were a lot of other studios who are very similarly minded, similarly in love with Bandra and their context. And one could create a loose affiliation of studios, which would essentially inform each other. It's a learning opportunity for people to interact. And everyone parks the egos aside. Like, we can all have massive ego-driven practices, but when you come into the Bandra Collective meetings, you have to park your egos on the side. Everyone makes fun of each other. Everyone is kind of, very promiscuously sharing projects with each other. We end up doing a lot of quick iterations because our work is usually very badly detailed. So a lot of other studios then say, okay, this is really shit work. Let us take this and, detail it better. So we become the quick iteration studio. So I think over time, a certain logic and a certain comfort with working has emerged, which still continues. And some of the projects that we've managed to be part of is, there's a few public playgrounds. So we actually offer pro bono services to the planning authorities. Like, the idea is that as a collective, one is able to move projects in and out of a very fluid ecosystem where no one is completely strapped for bandwidth or things don't get out of hand. But at the same time, there's a public skate park. There's some signage for Mount Mary Church, which was supposed to be a system of signages that will then be created in Bandra. So as and when funding arrives, we kind of are able to do small projects of this kind. One more amazing point of resonance was we used to run this secret dining initiative called Gypsy Kitchen. So it's a very simple format. It's a it's a sort of a source of secondary income for some of the most talented chefs, which are actually our own grannies and our own mums and our own house help in many cases. And the idea was that we get people who are extremely talented cooks, but who need a secondary source of income. So, for example, there was this a lady who used to work with my partner, and this is Chef Gresham Fernandez. He's the smiling guy with the beard. Someone he knew actually had to raise money for her mom's operation in Goa. So we actually did 3 dinners, and out of which, so the money from that dinner comes back into the home, which is then able to pay for medical expenses or pay for whatever else that the cook wants to do. And these are fairly elaborate, 13, 14 course meals. So it's cooked with a lot of heart and a lot of love. And what we realized is that the conversation after the meal was life-changing, because the kind of epiphanies that come out after you've had a few glasses of port and your belly is filled with 13, 14 courses of East Indian food. I mean, the kind of insight that comes out, and the kind of because you're feeling a sense of nostalgia, but you're struggling for words, right? Like there's this sort of very intangible spirit, and once that is given words, it's sometimes the first time those thoughts have been articulated. So around heritage, around what Bandra means to each one of us, how do we conserve this? How do we understand the grammar of what is being created around this table, and then extend it to architecture, to build space, to stuff like that? So these were fairly magical evenings, and this is something that really stayed with us as a practice as well. One more interesting thing was we were trying to raise money for this tiny oratory in Ranvar. It's a 170-year-old oratory. And we started wondering that why does this always need to come back to the ALM? Because the ALM is always strapped for funds. So we were wondering, can we use our kind of design input to create a little bit of a crowdsourcing, a crowdfunding kind of a program? So what we started doing was to create very detailed measure drawings of these tiny local icons and create a merchandising kind of a model. So you have these tiny DIY kits that were kind of sold for 1,000 rupees each. And I mean, the production cost of this comes to around 25, 30 rupees at scale. So essentially all that money is then given back to the ALM in a chunk. And we sold this around Christmas. So there was a lot of spirit of camaraderie and stuff like that. So basically, again, a small microeconomy model which just pushes money back into a local planning authority. And what was really interesting for us is that they chose not to paint the oratory, but they chose to pay 17,000 rupees of outstanding electricity bills. Right, so, and that is amazing. Like as a studio, we would never say, okay, pay outstanding electricity bill. You know, we would be much more interested in the beautification and it should look this, it should look that. So those paint samples were there for a year after that. And they were like, no, we don't need the paint right now. We just need to make sure the electricity is kind of taken care of, which is again incredible. We started doing this a little bit more. So this is a sort of a measure drawing of of St. Andrew's Church in Bandra. And again, a lovely old monument, and the idea was to kind of use this to support fundraising for church conservation projects. And what's interesting is that this, because it becomes a collectible and because something that you put together yourself, you start engaging with the architecture of the space. You start actually understanding how trusses support a roof, and it's a very, very fun activity for small kids. We've got pictures of this small oratory landing up in random shrines in Ahmedabad, and it's a very, very interesting how these things travel. And some more documentation. That's a really, really old artifact. It's a single stone monolith cross in St. Andrew's Church, which we kind of documented and creating a little bit of signage around as well. One interesting thing was a slight shift towards activism, which happened around the construction of the coastal road in Bombay. So a lot of the Bandra collective architects actually started wondering that, why is this town planning so opaque? Why does the DP come to us in this really, really opaque form, which it takes like 6 architects sitting for 3-4 hours to understand what is written on the drawings, because there's so many inconsistencies. And we started realizing that these inconsistencies are there by design, because they're designed to confuse and they're designed to become opaque. So what we started doing was just to create these kind of visualizations of what the coastal road is actually going to look like in Bombay. And this was obviously picked up by Scroll and a couple of other papers, which then tried to show to citizens what big infrastructure looks like. And then what we as a studio try to do a lot is write fake news. So we actually started putting out articles which were saying that the road on the construction is stopped on the coastal road. Buildings in Malabar Hill are complaining about vibrations in their foundations, and residents have started leaving. So these were picked up by activist groups and circulated widely as fake news, which was kind of trying to aid the effort of halting work on the coastal road. What's also interesting is that we had a fake competition where the state is asking for what do they do with these massive funds that are allocated for the coastal road. And then we also entered our fake competition with fake entries. So this is like a double tracking of the railway systems with a jogging track paid for by advertising. So, and I mean, at first glance, a lot of this work seems really strange. Like, why would you be doing this in the first place? But I think what happens is this was submitted in court as part of a PIL on Citizen Voice. Right, so I think a lot of design offices can actually support lawmakers and people who are filing PILs in the court with these kind of provocations, which show a better way to be. And I'll just end this with kind of coming for us, what we realized is that these pockets of resistance in the studio were very few and far between. We were getting swamped by the kind of F&B work that we were doing, working on unrealistic deadlines. We were sort of running on the Bombay treadmill, so to speak. So we kind of decided to take a break from a lot of that and try to build a practice in Goa that would be actually built around these other fringe experiments. And this had some amazing ripple effects. We kind of moved to Goa to this lovely shared space in Kitla, and we started running a few heritage labs, trying to understand what heritage feels like in VR, trying to understand, just inviting people to sort of share their insight with us. It's also introduced me to one of the most amazing people in Goa, Fanand, who did this amazing walk in the morning today. He was part of, I think, most of the labs in Goa, and he's changed the way that I kind of want to run my practice in Goa. With Fernand and another co-conspirator, Lester, we set up the Goa Collective, which in many ways is trying to do public domain work in Goa. We have a very sketchy contribution to Goa Collective. I think Fernand does most of the heavy lifting, but I write fake news again. So this is an article in O Heraldo that talks about how the Goa government is completely renewable, powered by renewable energy in 2035. And actually, what was really interesting is on this social media post, we got a lovely comment that said, actually, don't do solar panels. You should be investing in tidal energy and this thing, because solar panels go defunct in 25 years. So, it's lovely to start these kind of conversations through these random provocations, and you get a lovely engagement and a lovely public document that keeps building. We also have something called Rants de Goa, which I would encourage all of you guys to see. It's basically a very angry, ranting kind of a perspective on Goa, which is, and we would love to invite all you guys to submit your rants so we can convert them into these lovely documents. A little bit of Goa 2035. So we have a few speculative fiction projects running, which is, so sort of, for example, if one had to look at mine rehabilitation, which is a very important aspect of the Goan landscape that tends to get ignored because of the very deep mining interests. One could look at architecture as catalyst, right? So basically, a lot of these waters are laced with heavy metals. They're constantly leaching very, very poisonous chemicals into local communities. And if one could look at architecture being, the whole building as being a purification agent, which is constantly aerating water constantly, and then sort of creating a small tourism industry. So some of the projects we also look at trying to do through the Goa Collective is to provide visions of what a Goan landscape could look like in the next 15 to 20 years, and support it through kind of research and provocations. This is the repurposed defunct casinos. So once the casinos go bust, in a busted economy, people don't have much money to play with. So essentially, the casinos then become, aqua research places where you have a seaweed farm run by Gabriela. So we have these kind of shout outs to people who are doing fun stuff in Goa, and then we try to provide casinos as venues for those research objects. One more really, really fun one. So this is again with Fernand and the village in Shimbel. So this is a sort of a documentary, a documentation of one of the lovely old churches in Old Goa. And we worked with another partner, I think, who's going to be presenting later on today. This is Shashank from Tech for Wildlife. So he actually helped us with mapping this whole monument with a drone. And then we extracted a three-dimensional wire mesh from that footage. And then we are able to create visions of what a virtual church would look like, right? So you can actually reconstruct the church volume over the existing ruin in a wire mesh, and then actually grow the jungle back to create a church-like volume within the jungle. So there's no competition as such. The monument exists in a symbiosis with nature. It becomes like an outdoor sort of a space of worship, but at the same time, without trying to reconstruct in a fake manner the kind of history that we've already been witness to. And when you move things into the digital realm, some very, very interesting opportunities open up, because you can actually digitally repatriate objects that are now in private collections abroad or have become fairly politicized. So one can actually, through a process called photogrammetry, create three-dimensional meshes and repatriate the church, listen to the choir singing again in binaural audio. So all these experiences are available to us in the virtual realm, which are actually opportunities that we don't have in the real world. So these are the kind of projects that we're trying to work with in Goa. And yeah, that's been our journey. Thank you.
Amazing stuff. Ayaz, please sit. I'd like to take questions immediately from the audience. Does anyone have a question? Ayaz, you have moved to Aldona, and Aldona itself seems to be like developing, there's a connection. There are a number of people who say, well, now when I talk about Aldana, that Ayaz lives there. That you work from there and your studio is there. What about specifically Aldana, rooted directly to the village and that you've moved to? What is that connection working out like?
Truly it's been a bit like time travel. Like I think because I think just the soundscape of Aldona, like we have neighbors who play the most amazing fado in the evening. It's been a lot like walking around in Bandra and listening to the strains of guitar coming from somewhere. So I think we're still in this very romanticized kind of vision of the pastoral Goa. I'm sure we're missing many layers of interaction, but it's been amazing. I think for us as a practice, I think it's allowed us to become a sort of a narrower and deeper practice rather than being a shallow and wide practice, which we have to do to sustain and to kind of to kind of. So we also do like a Miguel's in Goa at the same time trying to do fake news. So it's been a bit of a schizophrenic time. But yeah, it's been amazing. I think this is home now.
That's amazing. I was struck a number of times you mentioned the word failure. I mean, it's all how you perceive failure. Is that a big part of your approach? Is like a no fear of failure? I mean, you're taking a lot of leaps, right? Including with this festival, which many people looking at the turnout might say is a failure, right? I mean, it's. Tell me about this the aspect. How does failure play into the process for you?
Wow. No, so I think one thing that we have realized is that all of these are iterative processes, right? The work is never done. So like even within say heritage conservation, like when would you hang up your boots and say, okay, the last monument has been conserved and now we can all retire? I mean, that's never going to happen. It's always a moving target. And I think this is what keeps culture churning. I think all of us, we're all part of some big experiment in any case. So I think it's a matter of within our own limited worldview, to kind of reach out and get as much critique for ourselves, as much clarity and as much knowledge. And I don't think this should be put into one person's purview. I think this clarity comes from actually a very democratic, very humble process where one is able to actually collaborate and lend your voice. I think a lot of clues come from, like, say, jazz music, right? Like if you're an amazing jazz drummer, you will not only be doing that, you will be looking to collaborate and grow your practice and collaborate with as many musicians as possible. And I think these are lovely metaphors for architecture and design, which tend to become extremely ego-driven practices. Like everyone's, framing a practice with their own name at the forefront, and it's that architect flourish sign at the bottom of drawings, which actually that's the enemy. That's the kind of that whole construct is the problem. Where then we have cities that manifest in extremely male or patriarchal or hierarchical ways. But I think the more democratic city is there. It's it's accessible. It's a matter of empowering as many people as possible and creating a common voice, really.
Wonderful to hear. I'm struck. You used the word community. This whole, actually bringing it back to what we've been trying to do here, it's an exercise in community curation, right? Which is the idea that can the community create these kinds of events? Because normally the curator is kind of a dictatorial kind of figure. But do you think that in your own experiments, I can see there's a great deal of resonance. So you did immediately understand. I should say, I messaged, I've never spoken to Ayaz. I know that Ayaz works in Goa. I know of his work. I'm an admirer of him. I messaged him one morning and said, please come and look at Adil Shah Palace. He lives in Aldana. And he showed up 45 minutes later to look at the Adil Shah Palace because of something that I explained to him over the phone. And he immediately got it, I think. So can you tell me a little bit, a message of encouragement, please, about this idea of community curation? Does it work? I mean, what's your experience been?
Yeah, I think, I think everyone looks up to precedents, right? Like, so if you have, 10 failed experiments, out of which 5 have reached some amount of fruition, and, someone's life has been enriched a little bit on that one particular day by a session or a talk or a interaction, I think people take back that they will be looking forward to the next iteration. I think these are long experiments. So I think, part of our experience with Goa Collective has been the same thing. Like, we're trying to create a very effervescent group. Like, I realized that I have a very limited way of looking at Goa because I came to Goa first time as a tourist, and that industry exists in a very kind of complicated relationship with the landscape, right? So it provides a certain livelihood, but at the same time it's very extractive. Not unlike, say, the mining industry. I think one could look at cultural mining as being one of the metaphors for understanding the tourism industry. So I think once we problematize it better, we're able to understand the depth of complexity, and then I think it also removes the heavy hand, right? Like because as planners and architects, we tend to have a very heavy hand. The architect and planner wet dream is tabula rasa, right? Like when you have a blank slate and you can draw straight lines everywhere. But I think, and today's talk really, today's walk, in fact, it really spelled that out, because you realize that you're engaging with a very, very complicated landscape. And I think the key to it is to problematize better. You critique first, critique your own actions first, and then I think the clarity emerges in smaller experiments, and it lightens the hand. It makes us do more iterative experiments. It makes us do smaller things. And it's a very different kind of engagement. And hopefully we're trying to set a model for engagement that outlives us. I think that's the kind of thing, that there's no project that we want to start today that we want to finish in our own lifetime. So I think this kind of slightly more, I think Native Americans call it the 7th generation thinking, where decisions you make today have to be thought about, that, how is this going to impact my 7th generation? And that way of thinking is very empowering. And if we look at the landscape as a 7th generation investment, I mean, we would never do mining practices the way we do right now, or even look at tourism the way we look at right now. I mean, this could become an agri-economy hub or a green hub, or there could be so many other visions of Goa that are not extractive, that are kind of regenerative. So
amazing. This is why Ayaz fits so well in Aldana, because our ancestors have thought in exactly the same way. A big hand for Ayaz BusRide.
Thank you very much.
How interesting and amazing. Please continue the conversation afterwards. I hope this is the first of many engagements. Thank you so much, Ayaz.
Thank you.
Please keep your